Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande.
It's something that Osirion doesn't need to fear from past Keltham modeled accurately, or other Osirian-like agencies accurately modeling other Keltham-like beings around greater reality. That property and the knowledge of it will have been preserved when all this dust settles, that the stranger from Dath Ilan never pretended to be anyone's friend after he stopped being their friend. It's not surprising that in Cheliax everyone needs to fear betrayal from everyone. Cheliax isn't trying to preserve the possibility of honor, friendship, or warm feelings between anybody and anybody.
Carissa does not really think that if Keltham destroys the world, observers in other universes will think that the possibility of honor or friendship with Dathilani has been preserved. Maybe, if they're being very careful about what they believe and have full and accurate information, that the apparent friendliness of a Dathilani is unlikely to be feigned. But mostly they would be correct to fear Dathilani and incorrect to befriend them if their world is anything like Golarion, and if Keltham in the end sees fit to destroy Golarion, especially if he doesn't destroy it over hell, but over it being not to his liking in one of 1,000 other ways. But she can now imagine the smaller, stupider Keltham reading Carissa as a Dath Ilani, reading Carissa's hesitation in that hallway as a dramatic declaration of war, as it would be in the homeworld he clearly misses dearly, and make sense of it, even if she doesn't think the dynamics that produce it really do reach across worlds. Carissa will try, then, reluctantly, because it always feels very dangerous to roll back an update about how dangerous someone is, to peel loose the inferences she made in that moment in the hallway. That when Keltham said he no longer owned her, he did not mean that he no longer demanded her obedience, but that he no longer promised, in exchange, his consideration. That there was no disobedience so small and trivial and petty that she could expect to survive the punishment for it. That those impulses in her to test things he said, to check if they were true, were incredibly hazardous and should be squelched instantly, that she had no affordance to want to know such things, and he would be furious with her for wondering. It didn't seem like a very Kelthamish way to be, but then he'd told her that he wasn't Keltham anymore, and she should stop modeling him based on what Keltham was like. And it does feel to her like there's some kind of strange attitude in New Keltham's thinking, a sense that he had the right not just to kill you, but not to face your defiance and fury about it. Not the pragmatic thing. She understands the pragmatic argument that as a practical matter, someone successfully concealing defiance and fury will be more likely to persuade someone not to kill them than someone letting it slip. But it felt, at times, like she was observing a sort of underlying conviction that anyone full of defiance and fury and loathing at their executioner was being badly behaved even if the pragmatic considerations didn't apply. She doesn't fully understand it. Maybe she's wrong to infer it's there. But she thought it was there, and that made it seem more plausible. That New Keltham was also someone who was incredibly dangerous to ever test or disobey. There was just a whole consistent explanation of him where he perceived many ways for his prisoners to misbehave and anger him, where he perceived himself entitled to their apparently eager and grateful cooperation with their execution, and she wasn't ever sure of it, but it seemed likely enough to make it obviously not worth testing again.
Does she still think now of him as executioner? A need in him, sadness, fear, horror, wishing that things had not turned out like this. He is suppressing thoughts of a correct answer for her to give, doesn't want her to just see his answer sheet and read it off.
The conversation about him not destroying the world if it isn't necessary to prevent hell was helpful. She thinks she could see her way to not seeing him that way if he is ready to destroy the world over hell. She doesn't think she can see him any other way if he is ready to destroy the world over people who want to live, not having all the things he thinks they ought to get. Or, she can probably see him whatever way is most helpful, but she'd be lying to herself to do it. The first and most important fact about any person is the power they have over you and what they are trying to do with it. And Keltham had power over her that they'd both chosen, and he loved her, and he was trying to build civilization. and now he is trying to destroy the world. She knows he'd rather not if he gets everything he wants, but if they were his only options, he'd rather destroy the world than let anyone live in it. He'd rather destroy her than build civilization with her. If they'd be building without a guarantee they could bring an end to hell eventually. It's like trying to see the stars in daytime, trying to see any fact about Keltham other than that.
There's still the choice to express that as executioner, to say it the way you would say it about somebody who wanted to kill you, would enjoy killing you, was passionlessly doing a job about killing you. That to him seems like the thing that is not in Dathilan. Or almost never in Dathilan, not often enough to make the statistically representative news there. Where you try to make your political opposition look worse than they actually are. Lie about that to yourself, exaggerate the problem beyond what it is, like you're deliberately unseeing the opposition's view of themselves and their own understanding of what they're doing, and substituting some alternate opposition that sees itself the way you see them, an opposition that only exists to show how right you are for hating them and opposing them. He's seen it now, he's read Galarian books, but it still seems to him like a huge horror and a great distortion of truth, this thing called hatred, that exists between two people wanting different things. It seemed to Mid-Keltham that there was something of a defection in it, in a cooperation-defection dilemma he was trying to play with Carissa, that if he'd been to Carissa, as Carissa was to himself, that he would have hated her and called her uncaring, cruel torturer of children, for that she'd have let the screaming paving stones stay in hell forever and ever, if that was the price of keeping Axis, and yelled like she didn't care or was happy about that. Where that would have been defecting, if he'd actually done that, and he was trying to cooperate instead, by trying to understand and see Carissa and her reasons as she saw herself, acknowledging her reasons for doing what she did, every time. Except that in Dathilan that's not even a thing you're taught to do for the other person, it's just being sensible, seeing things as they are. The truth about the way the opposition actually sees themselves is also part of reality. It seemed to him, sometimes, like Carissa was playing a game against him, where he was supposed to make that counter-move, and the game couldn't go on to whatever awful thing came next, until he hated her back. But this he could not bring himself to do.
She does not name him that because of how he feels about what he plans to do. She names him that because he intends to be the instrument of her death in the pursuit of his purpose. Hating someone can be about lying to yourself about them. Certainly, it is tempting to lie to yourself about other people for lots of reasons, and hating someone can be one of those reasons. So can loving someone. But, and Carissa doesn't have a fully developed theory here of how this ought to work, of how people ought to relate to each other. She never bothered coming up with one because she was very busy, and nothing suggested it'd really help if both of them were judging each other for falling short of their different communication ideals. It would be an error, right, to say that because loving people is a temptation to lie to yourself about them, you shouldn't love people. Carissa is sort of persuaded of a weak version of this claim, that for humans with normal human capabilities, you shouldn't love people because you'll be unable to avoid lying to yourself about them. But she thinks that a society of Carissai would instead try to teach all the Carissai how to love people without lying to yourself about them, instead of teaching them not to love. And similarly, they would try to teach all the Carissi how to hate people without lying to yourself about them, instead of teaching them not to hate. And if there were a negative utilitarian Carissa who was trying to destroy the world, everyone in the Carissa world would hate her, and yes, name her an executioner. It wouldn't be a game. It wouldn't be that she was supposed to make any move back. The dignified thing to do, really, would be to nod and say that the hate is just and deserved, that it is not wrong hate based on a lie about an enemy, but right hate based on a correct understanding of an enemy's true intent.
And is it just and deserved, rightful hate, that he hate Carissa for not caring enough about the paving stones in hell, that she'd sacrifice their pain to save Axis, maybe because she never really understood what pain and suffering are to people who don't end up doing well as devils? Is it right, for someone who has a different utility function to Carissa, that they hate Carissa for having a different utility function from them?
That does not feel like the principle she imagines her society abiding by, if she imagines that these intuitions had to come together as a set of rules to raise children by. Part of just hate, she thinks, is the hated entity having power to act. It feels undignified, vaguely like some kind of self-indulgence, to hate someone for having values they are in any event powerless to enact. It's taking something that ought to be about the state of the world and making it about something unshared, something you have no right to, the contents of their own mind. She proposes that you can hate people for what they're trying to do, not for what they wish in their heart. But it seems correct, certainly, for a paving stone to hate Carissa if they want to, for being unwilling to grant their prayers for destruction at the price she would have to pay for it. Not for not understanding, but for not acting. It would be reasonable and just to hate her for that, if she had the power to do something about it. And it is likewise an error, she thinks, to hate Asmodeus for having Asmodeus's utility function, but to hate him for all the torture? Yes, that is correct. Hating him for all the torture is entirely reasonable. If he hadn't done it yet but was trying his best, it'd be reasonable to hate him for that too. Carissa is pretty sure she hates Asmodeus, though she doesn't spend a lot of time on hating Asmodeus because she is pretty busy trying to kill him.
And here he was about to say that he had thought, not believingly, but in hopeless lack of understanding, that maybe the game was for both of them to hate each other, to demonstrate that they did have the ability to hate each other, to make clear their mutual alternatives to cooperation, and then for both of them to agree to give up the hate together as a symmetrical concession. And yet somehow, Carissa has found a frame where it's right and proper that she hate him because he'd destroy the world, and it's not okay for him to hate her about her willingness to leave the paving stones to hurt. He notes, despite that, it might not seem strategically wise to show Carissa this thought that increases her danger, because he still thinks of them as being on a more honorable footing than that, where they are still in some sense trying to help each other. He notes that his model of Carissa, or at least mid-Carissa, is that she's too quick to conclude she's powerless. It's an obvious thought that this mental reflex has been trained into her really hard by Cheliax, but still, she didn't leave with him at the World Wound for the nearest last wall encampment, because she did not realize that she was powerful. When they were in his doom base, she tried a little small defiance to see what would happen, and didn't realize that she was a fifth circle wizard confronting a first circle wizard, or that Mid-Keltham called for Tarnish because for all he knew, Carissa was about to dominate person him, or just kill him. He suspects that they might possibly be outside the strictest, tropiest routes of the possible story laid down by a higher entity, because so far as he knows, he's successfully left Broom behind in Osirion, and so far as Ione knew, Broom hadn't done anything proportionally important to his apparent story weight. That's unfired foreshadowing, and if it stays unfired, then maybe they get at least a little causality to work with, and don't need to be inside something that's absolutely and perfectly a story. But it wouldn't surprise him at all if Broom showed up out of nowhere and did something important, and the entire weight of decision ended up resting on Carissa. That is very much a way that a story might go if this was a story, and he is horrified and sickened by the thought that in this case, the paving stones might just stay in hell. Carissa Savar is at the very least not reliably powerless from the standpoint of somebody like him. In that context, then, the thought came to him. Getting to hate, but not be hated, because you think of yourself as powerless, is a kind of reward for thinking yourself powerless, and maybe you don't want to reward that thought.
First, a distinction. She thinks that hating someone ought to be about the things they are doing or trying to do, and sensitive to whether there's a chance they'll succeed. She does not think that you can hate people only if you are powerless, just only based on their actual capacities. He asked her if he was supposed to hate her for not caring enough about the paving stones in hell, and the answer to that, in the framework she thinks her world might use, is no. If he'd asked if he was supposed to hate her for trying to stop him, for being someone who might stop him, then she would have said yes, and given him the symmetry that seems so important to him in believing her, that her instincts and principles are not just about hurting him. If he hates her for the fact she would help Broom stop him if she could, if this did not qualify as a betrayal of her word, which she means to keep, then yes, that would be just. Hate based on a true model of her, based on something she really in fact might attempt, and based on what she is trying to do and not whether she cares about things deep in her own heart. It does seem important to her that a person in the dungeons of Igorian, hating Abigail Thrune and wishing her dead, is not the same as Abigail Thrune hating that person and enjoying herself as she plans their destruction. Carissa does actually think that a society of Carissae would embrace the dungeon person's hatred as an emotion it is not better to erase or suppress, except pragmatically. An emotion that is correct like grief is sometimes correct or like anger is sometimes correct. And she thinks a society of Carissae would judge Abigail Thrune for hating the prisoner back, as it would be a hatred out of proportion to the prisoner's actual ability to cause harm. With that said, there is something to that diagnosis of her, that she is quick to believe herself powerless, that in Cheliax an apparent opportunity to hurt someone powerful would be a test, that they tried very hard to make it the case that apparent power was still powerlessness, that seeing hope was no reason to believe there was hope. She isn't actually concerned at all about a reward for thinking yourself powerless. Being powerless is worse than most kinds of torture. The half-minute in the hallway while Keltham threatened to statue her is more memorable and more vivid and more terrifying and awful than any punishment she's ever undergone, save the other time someone threatened to statue her. There's no way any person with a functioning brain would like being powerless. But a person can be trained to have a very strong assumption that they are powerless, even if they see what appears to be an opportunity to change something. And it is actually still difficult to imagine to Carissa that Keltham would have reasonably believed himself in danger from her in his own fortress. He didn't have security trailing them. He didn't have items with spell resistance she had no hope of defeating, and contingent spells set to whisk him to safety if anything happened. He hadn't had someone with spell gauge confirm she had no remaining spells prepared and not expended.
Mid-Keltham had been, hoping for better, and letting himself hope unreasonably, because he didn't want to just die and be a keeper around Carissa. He'd let himself hope again, because it was one of very few things left for him to hold on to, and then suddenly realized that he should not have let himself be not a keeper even that much. He'd had Tarnish trailing them, but not in hearing range of their intimate conversation, not in a stop Carissa if she goes all out that instant way. Ridoul had run spell gauge on her, and confirmed no spells below 4th circle, but somebody wearing an artifact headband is easily bright enough to discharge all her 1st through 3rd spells to give the appearance of being out of magic as part of a plan. Osirian had claimed to have verified various truths about her, but if he needed to fool Osirian, he would not just give up and consider them unfoolable. The most powerful spell resistance items they now have were acquired in the City of Brass, and even those would not reliably keep Carissa out at her current known power level, even if she hasn't trained specifically in penetrating spell resistance. Mid-Keltham did not have the same level of protection. Just like her mind readily thinks of all the ways he might have stopped her, rendered her harmless, he thought of all the ways she might not be harmless, and he didn't have all the resources she imagines of him either. Above all, anyone with an artifact headband more powerful than yours is a huge threat, even if she truly doesn't have resources, because she might do something you didn't think of, if she doesn't think herself powerless. High probability, Dathilani fiction hammers this trope into the ground in part because of a keeper influence program to covertly caution people against trying to create smart things. That doesn't mean it's not true, they wouldn't deceive about that. But he's flagging it because the hopefully friendly terms of their cooperation seem to him to call for him to explicitly label all covert agenda Dathilani manipulations when exposing Carissa to them.
She appreciates his guesses at where Dathilani was engaged in manipulations. Once he threatened her, she did consider frantically if she had any way to kill herself. She didn't have any spells remaining, having prepared precisely the ones needed for the escape attempt, and her dagger wouldn't be fast enough. It wasn't last time. And she might have enough self-control now to drown herself on the first try, but wouldn't be unobserved for long enough. And she admittedly wasn't thinking clearly because her brain was no longer sure if it was Keltham or Abigail she was facing. But she didn't see a way. She still doesn't, for all her new enhancements. That does not mean he doesn't have a point, of course. But she thinks the failure was less one of failing to notice a real way to be dangerous, and more failing to notice that Keltham might have perceived himself to be in danger.
A flash of idle wondering, humorous anticipation of possible humor, worried concern, and it's probably not best if they try to avert emotions like that. Did Carissa ever get in trouble with anyone else that way, like, say, the Church or Crown of Cheliax?
Yes, actually. How did he guess? She absolutely failed to notice the ways in which Abigail would parse her as a threat to Abigail's power, a mistake which would definitely have been fatal, except Abigail likes her.
Concern.
Carissa is planning to kill Abigail if it's useful, which it might be under a whole class of plans to delay Cheliax's invasion of Osirion slightly. And she is clear on the fact Abigail is very, very evil, and was manipulating her every moment of their acquaintance. But yes, she still feels that way about her. See, Abigail swore to Carissa that she would never turn her into a statue forever, even if Carissa betrayed her deliberately.
He suspects Carissa of having some sort of fear, threat exaggeration syndrome going on, possibly because of, the whole Cheliax thing. But it also rhymes with the kind of small comfort that being tiny and powerless and threatened can bring you. Keltham didn't say he'd turn her into a statue forever. He said that he was going to statue her until he'd raised his own intelligence to match hers. If he was meant to take on responsibility for her own reactions like a parent of something safely powerless, then it was foolish of Keltham not to consider the truth plus falsity complex possibility where past Carissa had told the truth about her statuing fear, as had appeared to past Keltham under detect anxieties, but been truthful but misleading to him in her presentation, and later truth-spelled presentation, that led past Keltham to infer Abigail had desensitized the fear by enacting it. But it does seem like the thing that Keltham said was not what Carissa heard, and he hopes that she is just past this now, in virtue of having been wished beyond it, but if not, he doesn't know what to do, around somebody who hears a different thing than what you say. If you're not so much smarter than them, and so understanding of their alienness, that you can exactly manipulate your messaging.
He said at least until he was fully augmented with wishes, and possibly until he obtained an artifact headband, which she had no reason to think he would do before he destroyed the world, which she realized in that exact instant he was planning to do and probably planning to do in a matter of weeks. She understands now that to Keltham, rounding that to potentially forever is a suspicious kind of rounding to do. A kind of motivated rounding like calling someone an executioner when that carries implications they are unbothered by the killings they are committing. Now that she understands him better, she is trying to be more careful to distinguish details when she thinks them, to note that he said he would statue her at least until he was wished up, and only possibly until something happened that she considered quite unlikely to happen before the end, and she imagines he evaluated it unlikely he would get killed in the City of Brass, and that she would never be unstatued. But Carissa was not making that distinction, and did not place much weight on the at least, and parsed the situation as very probably one from which she would never wake before her ultimate destruction. She thinks that if you are talking to Galarian people over whom you have absolute power, you do need indeed either great skill or great caution to not terrorize them out of their minds when you explain how your best alternative to their cooperation is to turn them into a statue potentially until you've obtained an artifact headband. Galarian people do not in fact parse that as not a threat, but as a threat framed bizarrely. They do not automatically believe you about your claims about what's in your own interests, absent their cooperation, and assume you will exaggerate or lie about or muddle those to get the concessions you want. And so they have only the action to evaluate, obviously threat-like in nature. She thinks that mostly Galarian people with absolute power handle this by just giving orders, in cases where their words are backed by implicit willingness to turn to stone, and saving negotiations for cases where their words are not backed by implicit willingness to turn to stone. Abigail made her no longer afraid she would statue Carissa for disobedient thoughts, and therefore no longer interrupted by constant terror whenever she had a thought that she imagined might provoke the queen. Abigail did that by assuring her it wouldn't happen for real, not by making it something that she wouldn't be scared of if it was going to happen for real. What she thinks she'd say is that she is no longer excessively afraid of it in a fashion that consumes her attention when there's no chance of it and puts her at more risk of it, but that she remains convinced it is nearly the worst thing that could happen from the perspective of her values and worth, arbitrary suffering to avoid. And it's still true that if you ask her to choose between being a statue temporarily or jumping into a lake of fire, she'll pick the lake of fire. But the fact she was able to respond to Keltham coherently and then try to depart his presence so she didn't annoy him with her breakdown, instead of having the breakdown on the spot or trying to gouge his eyes out in the hopes she could provoke Tarnish to kill her, was probably to Abigail's credit.
He's not sure enough that he qualifies sufficiently as mid-Keltham to apologize for him, and the whole concept of just saying sorry to somebody is not very Dathilani for reasons probably not worth going into right now. But it can at least be said that he regrets the distress inflicted, didn't intend it, and would not do that again given a second chance to do it. His mind is currently trying to set aside for later all of the concerns suddenly raised about Abigail Throon as his ongoing romantic competitor or metamor. Or maybe she's won, and if that doesn't just mean story over, maybe it fires the flag event where he's supposed to force Carissa to testify to that fact under truth spell, so he takes legal ownership of Carissa from Cheliax. He doesn't actually see the point now, but he's going to have to re-examine his possible potential plot structures map, checking the whole thing for where owning Carissa might be relevant.
Carissa acknowledges that Dath Ilani trope reasoning does not come naturally to her, but she really thinks that the Abigail plotline will end when Carissa kills her, or if things go really well, brings her around to their side. This does not require anything of Keltham, who cut off romantic plots with Carissa when he, told her to stop considering herself his. That wasn't some ridiculous alien miscommunication, right? That is what he told her?
It was a kind of saying goodbye, yes, though he acknowledges fault in not making that more explicit than it was. He was planning to destroy creation, modulo Caden alternatives he doesn't get moral credit for, and become a god, and he did not see either of those things as offering hope of them living happily ever after together. He didn't want to offer her false hope. It hurt, but she knows that, right? He thinks she already knew that, but he's been wrong too many times before.
She knows that. She knows that he loved her, and she loved him, and she wishes that it could have been real, and she meant it, when she told him that if the world survived, she would stay with him. But she doesn't expect it.
He's just going to think it, instead of fighting it down. What exactly did Abigail Throon tell her, when she promised not to make Carissa a statue?
She has a much better memory these days, with all her enhancements, but that she remembered word for word from the day it happened. I, Abigail Throon II, swear in Asmodeus's name never to make you a statue for true, she said, and then, though at this level of breadth and consequence I'll make no oath of it without greater payment, I also promise not to seek particularly to destroy your soul by any means nor deprive it of its eternity.
She knows, doesn't she, that he could swear that same oath to her and mean it, that he'd put her on that arc to Elysium if he could, if she'd let him. Abigail. Throon's oath doesn't even force her to do that much, if she plans on destroying all the souls in Galarian herself. Would she bother to get Carissa out of the way, if that happened? Abigail Throon might think it romantic for the two of them to true die together, if she didn't happen to seek particularly to destroy Carissa's soul, and Carissa just happened to be around when it happened. Abigail wouldn't care very much, on his read of her, that Carissa herself didn't think it so romantic. Abigail Throon has perma-statued people. It doesn't bother him because if creation survives, then civilization will dig those people up in time, and if not, they'll end up elsewhere. Or if Carissa talks him into it, maybe he won't demand that much of Pharasma, that future Pharasman civilization, predictably advanced to the point of digging up those people, and they can stay statues forever, for real. As Abigail Throon chose to happen, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. There is still a part of his brain that feels sort of indignant about how possibly one of Carissa's romantic interests is being judged much more leniently than the other, here.
She'd pay a very, very high price for civilization to advance to the point of digging up those statues. Not the destruction of everything, that's too high a price, but nearly anything else. She would, for what it's worth, hate Abigail if she suspected Abigail were trying to destroy the world. Not even in the complicated way she hates Keltham. There would be none of what she loves in Abigail if Abigail were trying to destroy creation. But it's true that she doesn't judge them the same way, and also that if she were being properly coherent, she would hold more of Abigail's conduct against Abigail. Because the Abigail who hurts Carissa to make her stronger is not the only Abigail, and she often hurts people much worse, for no cause at all. She doesn't have much to say in defense of the part of her that feels warm and joyous when she observes that Abigail likes her.
He suspects that if he himself had permastatued anyone, intending for them to never return, nor knowing anything of elsewheres, that Carissa would be notably more upset with him about that. And it maybe shouldn't be important, this thing, when so much between them is already shattered, except that it seems to rhyme with other things, that to his perspective look like there is something harsh in her, towards him, that he doesn't know how to deal with, for that it isn't in Dath Ilan, or Dath Ilan trains its people out of it.
Carissa doesn't have an answer to that ready, and she notices herself flinching away from just pointing her mind at it and thinking, because she has no idea where that will take her, and that's frightening. And she thinks she doesn't trust, not fully, that nothing will go wrong. If she digs through her mind for an answer and it's an ugly one or a cruel one or an irrational one that makes Keltham think he shouldn't listen to her about anything.
Past Keltham's model of civilization's wisdom and keeper wisdom would have sagely pronounced that it's not a great idea to leave something lying around like that in yourself, under these circumstances, that you ought to set it aside and be sane instead, if the world is otherwise ending. This version of him feels less sure of what the true keepers out of Dath Ilan would say. He knows that hate is possible to him. Past Keltham hated Abigail Thrune for a very brief period between when he realized what had been done to him and when he applied Owl's wisdom to himself and lost that brief flash of emotion. And he wonders if the true keepers out of Dath Ilan would know, being wiser than he, and little if at all less intelligent, with far more training and maybe greater in dimensions of Thinkumph that Golarian's 3 magics don't augment, if the keepers would know already that Dath Ilan damaged itself in some way, in the past, by trying to breed hatred out of itself. Maybe anger, too. He thinks a Galarianite in his place would have been angry with Cheliax for what it had done, and not lost that thread of anger when they used an owl's wisdom. If Carissa had deliberately and knowingly sent Peranza and Asmodia to hell to be hurt and warped and damaged beyond repair in hell, and not sacrificed her own soul to save them either, and didn't seem to feel she'd done wrong, then it wouldn't have made him hate her, wouldn't have made him be unfair to her. It would have destroyed something in him that he still holds for Carissa, though it burns his mental hands to hold it. But even for that, he wouldn't be towards her as she is towards him. He never hated Pharasma even when he confirmed that there were children in hell. Not because he made a strategic decision, but because she wasn't close enough to his frame of reference to be meaningfully hateable. Or maybe that's trying to justify with reasons what's just reasonless biology. Maybe Dath Ilan bred anger out of itself, and maybe that has something to do with the way that happiness is such a fragile state that they have to work so hard to protect. It remains that whatever is in Carissa now, even if it's there because she's whole in a way that Dath Ilani are broken, it is something very alien to him, that makes him want to run away and not try to face whatever this thing is in her. His current and better model of a keeper doesn't say for Carissa to force herself to look at it right now, but it doesn't say that it's safe for Carissa to ignore. There's a lot of things in past Carissa that it's not safe for this Carissa to ignore. Fear that warps reality to be scarier, hatred that warps reality to be more hateable, a set of emotional benefits from feeling small and powerless that nearly got her killed when other people didn't see her that way, and probably a whole long list of other things like that.
Oh, she plans to look at it. Just possibly not while Keltham is reading her mind.
He said now, things that are supposedly true about her, despite not himself being Carissa Seaver. He has the sense that he's been directing a lot of this conversation. Admittedly, he was the one who scheduled it, but still, there's probably something Carissa herself would want to say about how he can try to take a shape that she can deal with, where this itself is not something that he modeled himself as being able to ask of her, while there was that harshness in her. Her past requests, like say them about Keltham attitudes instead of about Dath Ilan attitudes, because I kind of have a grudge against your home planet, are things that it wouldn't have been healthy for Mid-Keltham to go along with. But maybe they can manage to negotiate a comms protocol that they're both happy with, and isn't meant to hurt him for his crime of being an executioner.
It wasn't about hurting him, her request that he talk about Keltham and not about Dath Ilan. It was about, so it's not the first time that Carissa has had sex that she would have refused if she had a choice, right? That's the kind of thing that happens sometimes unless you expend a very costly amount of effort on avoiding it. It hasn't really had long-term negative effects on her before. It kind of sucks, but lots of things kind of suck. You don't want to be a person who gets damaged by harmless kind of sucky things happening. This one bothered her. And the reason it bothered her is that Keltham had asked her not to do it. It's not his fault. It's entirely her fault. She genuinely wasn't trying to make it his problem, but the reason that it bothered her was that she had been trying to meet Keltham inside his strange world. And that was a promise she made Keltham himself, as an individual, because she loved him, not inside any greater system that made any sense, just her and her best understanding of him. She would not have made a promise like that to Dath Ilan. She doesn't love Dath Ilan, and it doesn't love her, and she actually does not care at all about, would not take any comfort in, whatever Dath Ilan has to say about what happened. If Keltham is gone, as he sometimes says he is, then there isn't anything anyone can say that would help and not hurt. But offering her what Dath Ilan has to say is some kind of cruel parody of the thing that she wanted. It wasn't a promise to Dath Ilan. It feels a little bit like there was a pattern like that, where every individual time Carissa did try to tell Keltham what would make it possible to speak with him, he extrapolated a reason for her to say it, which was irrationality or cruelty or unreasonableness, and then rejected her irrationality or cruelty or unreasonableness, and Carissa was muddled and scared and in pain, but she was trying very, very hard to describe to Keltham what he could do if he didn't want to hurt her, and he never wanted to do it. So she made up a Keltham inside her own head who was, well, inspired by Keltham, not the real person, but he would say whatever Keltham was saying, except if she asked him not to hurt her, he would do it, and he wouldn't treat her like the confusion between them was a product of Carissa being ridiculous and inexplicable, and he spoke her language instead of resenting her for not being a native speaker of his, and everything he said was reasonable, even if he had to search really hard to come up with a reasonable thing that might be what Keltham meant. It wasn't that her Keltham was always right about what real Keltham was doing. She didn't know what real Keltham was doing. But she had to try every sentence he spoke to come up with reasonable things that he could have been saying if he wasn't trying to hurt her, or trying to make a point about how wrong she was, or trying to prove Dath Ilan was better than she was. And it just feels like Keltham usually didn't try, when Carissa said things, to come up with 5 reasonable things she could mean, while every time Keltham said anything, Carissa was trying with all her might to come up with 5 reasonable things he might have meant. And it felt like when she tried desperately to tell him what he could do to not hurt her, he listened and then categorically refused to do it. And that was suggestive about how well it would go if she kept desperately trying.
Everything about her seemed like a scream of pain, injury, of not wanting him to be who he was, not wanting this to be happening, and to be infused with a sense that it was right and proper for her to feel that way, and improper for him to object, such that for him to object to anything would have only hurt her more, and raised more of the sharp poisonous thing against him. So Keltham wrapped himself up in himself and retreated to wait it out, thinking that if she wanted there to be calms between them, she could just come to him and say, "Hey, let's sit down and negotiate a mutually agreeable comms protocol." Keltham knew, to be clear, that Carissa wouldn't, because she wasn't Dath Ilani and hadn't been raised to think of going meta about comms protocols as an obvious solution, because she didn't have a standard protocol for doing metacomms where you're both trying not to be emotional or confrontational about that, and because she wouldn't, on his model, trust anything that sounded like it came from Dath Ilan, would have seen it as an attempt to injure her if he'd offered anything of Dath Ilan's, not to mention he'd gotten rather poor results from trying to go meta about comms with other insufficiently enhanced Galarianites, often with things getting into apparently irretrievable states of hostility. So all that Keltham could do was wait for her to be wiser and hopefully possible to talk to without injuring.
When she said to him, "Maybe you could say them, but just say them about Keltham attitudes instead of about Dath Ilan attitudes because I kind of have a grudge against your home planet's way of doing ethics right now," that was, actually, an effort to negotiate a communications protocol. Perhaps bracketed wrongly, perhaps she didn't do the right meta-communication. Perhaps it would have worked if, instead of "maybe you could say," she'd said, "proposed communications protocol." But she was trying. When he asked, she told him what he could do that would help her and not hurt to hear. She asked him to tell her what Keltham thought about her being raped, instead of what Dath Ilan had to say, because hearing what Keltham thought would help, and hearing what Dath Ilan thought wouldn't. He refused to do that, which, as she had predicted it would, hurt very badly, and she stopped after that, trying to tell Keltham how to communicate with her in a way that hurt her less.
If that was her only desperate attempt to negotiate a comms protocol, the only chance he'd gotten, though the main meta tag on it seemed to be that she felt it necessary to attach to that felt to him, like it carried a state of sharpness towards Dath Ilan, holding herself injured by Dath Ilan. But if that was misleading to him, and actually the meta content was, Keltham, this is my last attempt to reach out to you, respond in the right way or you won't get another one, then from his perspective, things were not clearly labeled. Maybe because in Cheliax you must not label things, you must give exactly the right test, and the other person must give exactly the right response, and nothing can ever be legible, or that's all kinds of weakness and vulnerability. If that was his last chance, he didn't know, and if that was the comms situation, he didn't know, and if something like that arises in the future, he's probably still not going to know unless she tells him, because she is very alien. He is a bit smarter now, but stupid nonetheless, and she has become a very smart alien in turn. This potentially cancels out unless they meet on grounds of pure law, rather than emotions complicated further by intelligence. Any time she does something that isn't what sensible ideal agents would do, agents outside of Cheliax to be clear, he's not going to be able to deduce it from first principles unless she labels it. It's one reason why this whole conversation seemed impossible, unless they could both use simultaneous detect thoughts at INT-29 and get to some point beyond which it would be possible to go meta and reconcile comms conflicts.
The intended meta-content was that she understood her kind of grudge against Dath Ilan was not something Keltham would necessarily be sympathetic to, and she wasn't sure future Carissa would share it, thus specifying that it was something she felt right now, not necessarily a long-lasting state of affairs. She tried piling on a lot of disclaimers, kind of, a grudge, right now, to make it clear that it wasn't an endorsed anti-Dath Ilan position she was advancing, or a policy she was demanding in full generality, but a current and specific need. Also, that wasn't the only time. There was an earlier time where she told him that the conversation would be less painful and more bearable for her if he'd stop bringing up Dath Ilan, which he did not see fit to acknowledge as a request at all, and a later time when she was just on the brink of giving up, where she told him that she didn't know if the approaches that seemed to her like they ought to work really would, since they hadn't been tried, and so was willing and ready to proceed only by Dath Ilani rules. He could have told her then that he was open to negotiation, if he was, which he gave no sign of. Carissa thinks that sensible ideal agents might, in fact, try 2 times to quietly bring up something important to them, and get refused both times, and then try saying more explicitly that they have ideas for how things could work better, but those ideas haven't been tested and they're willing to just obey the other's protocols. She thinks that actually nothing Keltham did had anything to do with his inability to understand anyone who doesn't behave like a sensible ideal agent. He was not behaving like a sensible ideal agent. He was behaving like a scared, injured, traumatized person who didn't want to give Carissa the thing she said was important to her and who wasn't actually very interested in her ideas for how communication might work, especially since she disclaimed that she didn't know if they'd really work. She was behaving like a scared, injured, traumatized person who wanted Keltham to stop doing a thing that was really hurting her, was aware she had no leverage for this request, did not know the magical words that would render her permitted in his framework to make it, tried a couple of different ways of making it anyway, and then gave up and told him she was giving up and adopting his framework. She is actually fine with the fact she gave up and adopted his framework. There are important battles to pick here, and this isn't one of them. But she is sad if Keltham's narrative about his prisoner trying to tell him what she needed, being refused, and then figuring out how not to need it, and then telling him she had done that and communicating by his rules from then onwards, is that she could simply have said the magic words if she wanted something different to happen. She did not know the magic words. She tried to talk to him with the only words she had, and it didn't work, And so she gave up and did the rest the Dathilani way for the rest of their acquaintance without ever complaining about how much it hurt her, and she is fine with the fact that this happened. But she does think that it did happen.
If she's thinking of the 2 occasions he thinks she's thinking of, then when she said, "This isn't a demand, but if you shut up about Dathilan, it'll require less self-control from me to talk to you like a civilized person." He took that completely at face value, as a factual statement, Dathilan style, and made a mental note not to talk about Dathilan unless there was a sufficiently strong reason to put that demand on Mid-Carissa's internal attention, and shortly after said, "You are kind," which is a type of acknowledgement that Mid-Carissa almost never offered him, the many, many times that he tried to be kind, and then gave her all that she asked for in negotiations. If he was also supposed to acknowledge the request a particular exact way, because otherwise Mid-Carissa thought she was being ignored, then this is the kind of thing that needs to be explicitly labeled in the future, even now, because she is, he thinks, just vastly, vastly overestimating how legible she is to him. A lot of his knowledge he does have about her comes from a time when he doesn't know, even now, which things were lies or truth, and she does know which things are lies or truth, and is probably under-adjusting for how much she thinks he can guess. When she said, "I think I can have this conversation by Dathilan rules," the next event was that he did describe Dathilan rules to her, and then that conversation, which she wanted to have, happened and was useful, and then they had some conversation after the not by strict Dath-Ilani rules for formally navigating disagreements. And then that worked around to where it could blow up. And then he went back to figuring that they should try to have less emotional conversations until everyone was INT 29.
Oh, it is in fact useful to know that Keltham changed his behavior off Carissa, trying to communicate that it would be helpful. He still brought up Dathilan a lot after that, including in situations where she didn't see why it was necessary, so she assumed that he had not changed his behavior at all, and mostly did not try to communicate like that again. If he had said, "I will try to do that somewhat less often," or "I will keep that in mind," then she would have volunteered far more statements like that. He's also not legible to her. She can only guess whether things she said have any effect on him if he acknowledges them or, observably, to her changes her behavior based on them.
He's not actually thinking at this point that he was mistaken to try to preserve the tiny shreds of their relationship to where they could talk about it using INT 29 and telepathy. He still feels pretty much like a scared, injured, traumatized person to whom nothing much good is going to happen in the future, it not being safe, nor really kind, to forcibly edit himself to be otherwise. But it does help to be a smarter and telepathic such person.
She thinks waiting was pretty reasonable. She just feels sad, lost, like the bulk of her effort was wasted or at least not noticed. If Keltham's narrative about communications is that Carissa was unwilling to try because of her dislike of Dathilan, when she set aside her dislike of Dathilan and accepted all her needs would go unmet and tried to conduct all future conversation by Dathilani. I protocols and would have kept trying if Keltham had asked her to. The reason why she did not use the magic words, "Hey, let's sit down and negotiate a mutually agreeable comms protocol," is not that she wasn't willing to communicate in a Dath-Ilani way. She tried very, very hard to communicate in a Dath-Ilani way once he gave her examples and instructions. It is that she did not know those words.
There's a strong impression he's getting right now, from the situation, not from Carissa's actual thoughts, that he is placed into a game where the next move he's supposed to make is to show those times when he tried to show kindness, openness, vulnerability, concession, acknowledgement of her own position and reasons, to Carissa, and didn't get back things he interpreted as the sort of encouragement you might show somebody if you wanted him to repeat that behavior or double down on it. And if he doesn't drag up those examples, he loses this game. He doesn't think that's a game Carissa means to play. That doesn't mean Cheliak's Galarian never carved it into her.
She thinks that those examples would be very useful for helping her attach the abstract belief she has been maintaining and espousing the whole time, that he is trying as hard as she is to some specific features of his behavior. She will probably, if there are no examples, change her mind slightly about whether that belief she has been maintaining and espousing this whole time is actually true. That seems reasonable to her? It is helpful to replace the abstract belief someone else is trying hard with specific examples of times and ways they tried hard, and their communications weren't met with any signal they could usefully interpret. And in the case where actually one of them isn't trying very hard, it'd be helpful for that to come to light too. It seems like Keltham thinks that finding examples is some kind of bad game to play, and she understands that often when he has objections like that, he has good reasons behind them. But that is absolutely something Carissa is doing deliberately, and what she thought the point of this conversation was, to help them both arrive at, hopefully, the more grounded belief that the other person has been trying very hard. Also, once they have some examples of where exactly they misunderstand each other, they can change their behavior in similar situations in the future. Like, if Carissa is ever again tempted to say, "If you do X less, it'll make it easier for me to not get mad," she will add, "If you are going to act on this advice, I would appreciate you saying that you intend to do so." And she definitely won't, when mildly annoyed with Keltham, do anything that might be possible to misinterpret as withdrawing from friendship and cooperation. And if she finds herself getting tired of Dath Ilani communication norms, instead of, "I have my own ideas about how people could communicate healthily, but I sure didn't get them from Cheliax and I don't know if they'll work," she will say, "Hey, let's sit down and negotiate a mutually agreeable comms protocol."
Those two phrasings would in fact have been near semantic equivalents to him, but he appreciates that she has no way of knowing this important fact due to his alien illegibility. This is a kind of constant acknowledging of the other's position and difficulties that Dath Ilani are trained to do, that he can see the point of doing during difficult comms problems. Tag, this is a Dath Ilani technique, as is a fact that Carissa on his model once tagged.
Huh. In her dialect, the first of those is near semantically equivalent to the thing she did say. The Chelish way of doing this is for everyone to conceal all their feelings at all times, so it's entirely possible I'm too optimistic about approaches that don't require that, and they really don't actually work. Which is itself an attempt at the acknowledging the limitations of one, its own state of knowledge, which she was doing because she hoped it was close to a Dath Ilani thing Keltham was looking for. She appreciates the thing he did with Dath Ilani use, mentions there.
Context matters a lot there. If she approaches him visibly intending to start a conversation, and the topic of that conversation is to be, "I have my own ideas about how people could communicate healthily, but I sure didn't get them from Cheliax, and I don't know if they'll work," then clearly they're supposed to set aside a chunk of time and talk about this separate topic, Carissa's ideas about healthy communication. If she says in the course of another conversation, "The Chelish way of doing this is for everyone to conceal all their feelings at all times, so it's entirely possible I'm too optimistic about approaches that don't require that, and they really don't actually work, that doesn't call for a chunk of time set aside the same way." If you say, "Hey, let's sit down and negotiate a mutually agreeable comms protocol," it works context-free because everything is explicit. He wouldn't have guessed, without telepathy nor labeling, that she'd appreciated his last-use mention tag, and he appreciates the explicit labeling and feels encouraged to do it again. He wouldn't have been able to infer the appreciation from context. It definitely didn't show on her face. Carissa possibly still has too much habit of hiding all information about her reactions, as of course a tiny powerless thing should, in Cheliax.
She's been not having visible emotional reactions for a different reason lately, actually. Her understanding of Keltham's preferences and Dathilan's norms were that emotions can be quoted but not projected at someone in civilized conversation, and so she has been trying very hard for it to be impossible to infer her emotional state. Admittedly, Cheliax gave her a ton of practice.
It's okay to project appreciation for things to him. He hadn't meant to communicate not that. Positive emotions are usually okay to show. Obviously, there's all sorts of ways they can be twisted into weapons, but if you're not doing those things, then you're probably okay. Meanwhile, in a different linear substream of thought. It's maybe not the best example, but it seems to be making itself very prominent within his own mind, so he'll just say it. There was a time, reopening conversation after his augmentation, when he tried tentatively to show vulnerability and his past hurt, and talk about the importance of reaching out to someone else, and how he appreciated how she'd done that in the past, even if it was illusion, and appreciated it more after he'd had normal Galarian people to contrast that to, and finished, "Even if it's only under threat of the multiverse being destroyed, I'm glad to be with the Carissa who also reaches back. Where, even under the threat of the multiverse being destroyed, is a way of showing that you understand the other's positions, that they're being nice to you, even though their own perspective might not place you so firmly in the right as you feel yourself. Now contrast that to the possibility where, if instead he'd tagged it with Carissa's past injury of him, under threat he understands that it was under threat, to emphasize how forgiving he was, as is the sort of thing where he feels there's a Galarian game that expects him to do that, and he did not that, tag Dathilan teaches this, so he was also voluntarily giving ground in that game, and Carissa's response was dispassionate in facial expression. I think it wasn't just the conspiracy. I think I got put in charge of the conspiracy because I wanted to understand you so badly that I was better at it than anyone else. A causal history of how past Carissa had come to do that thing. Nothing encouraging him to show vulnerability or reach back more. Nothing to reward the risky behavior he'd just tested, not even by a statement of positive hope about the results if they went on trying to meet each other in the middle. He knew he did not know what was happening inside Carissa, but his guess was that the sharpness and anger inside her did not want him trying to be nice to her, that this felt to her like an implicit pressure and commandment to reward him, who was a terrible person who ought never to be rewarded when he was planning to destroy Galarian. So he folded back into himself and didn't throw any more emotions at her like that, or other attempted emotional vulnerabilities or shows of positive feeling that she might have had to answer with another expressionless bit of history.
That answer was meant to be reassuring, meant to be emotional, meant to acknowledge his point and try to offer him everything that might have helped him come to terms with it. She thought, as probably isn't surprising to him at this point, that he was asking for reassurance that he would be understood outside the conspiracy, that the conspiracy was not the only place he would ever find anyone willing to try to understand him. So she assured him of that it hadn't just been the conspiracy. She thought he would find it reassuring to learn that the causality had run the other way, to learn that she had wanted to understand him so desperately she'd ended up in charge of the conspiracy, because that would mean the wanting to understand him was about her and not about the conspiracy. And of course she was cautious about showing much emotion, because he had said that there were Ilani techniques for quoting emotions, but you weren't supposed to just have them at people.
It seems like there were ways they could have figured this out without INT-29 and mutual telepathy, and at the same time, like anything they'd tried before, this would probably not actually have worked in real life. Well, they did try things at each other, and they didn't work.
She is sorry that he didn't hear what he needed to hear. The thing he said was meaningful to her. She thinks that any individual case could maybe have been avoided if one of them had just happened to say a slightly different version of what they felt, but they kept talking until it blew up, right? Every time. So probably they would inevitably have kept talking and then it'd blow up a little later. Probably they wouldn't have gotten lucky enough to understand each other the 3 times in a row or something it would have taken to actually start suspecting. On an emotional level, not on the logical level where she would have stubbornly maintained all along that Keltham was probably trying as hard as she was, that the other person was trying.
In Dathilan, there is a standard practice for resolving marital disputes, particularly disputes where both sides think they're communicating more clearly than the other, or where both sides think they're being charitable and the other side is being uncharitable. This standard practice is to install audio recorders in all the rooms in the house, wait a month to collect data, and then submit a record of all tense marital interactions to a panel of 3 confidentiality sworn judges to determine whom the judges thought had argued more validly or behaved less helpfully. Often, of course, the knowledge that your disputes are going to be reviewed, or seeing how your friends bet in the prediction market about who's going to win, is sufficient in itself to clear up a relationship conflict. But fundamentally, the reason why so many marriage disputes end up in unhealthy mental states is because the married parties don't have a good way to objectively score their performances, or tell who's actually winning at being the more helpful partner. And the solution, audio recorders and third-party judges, is straightforward, but you have to actually do it, and preferably before your relationship finishes falling apart. There can be other things that go wrong with a relationship, of course, but all those things are easier to resolve after you've established common knowledge of who's currently winning and by what sort of margin. Mid-Keltham didn't suggest this course of action back then, mostly because he didn't know where to find fair judges between himself and Carissa. Even an inevitable from Axis would still be of creation, might fail to understand both sides, and might not have enough law that it was allowed to speak of in Galarian. And also because something about the whole thought seemed off with respect to relationships in Galarian. Like maybe Galarian relationships did in fact tend to revolve around other problems than that.
He doesn't really want to think this. It feels like picking up a heating stone that is too hot and that he'd only just put down. But part of him wonders now, if Abigail Thrune can deliberately try to destroy people's eternities for fun and believe she's succeeded and still be a romantic interest of Carissa's. It's probably too late now to change whatever he did wrong, but it makes him feel like he lost Carissa through some misstep that came before planning to destroy creation. That their relationship could have survived that if he'd done whatever it was that Abigail Thrune had done right. Hurt Carissa more, taken more thorough ownership of her, before it was too late maybe. It's not particularly a healthy topic, but he can tell that his mind isn't naturally going to leave it alone, so long as it remains an unsolved mystery. If he literally just needs to be more physically attractive, there's probably an outer plane that'll sell that to him, though he's reluctant to enter into hell to deal there.
She did still love Keltham, was in Keltham's preferred framework still a love interest of Keltham's, up until he told her that Keltham was dead and she was not his anymore. Did she somehow misunderstand that too?
He told her then that what he meant by that was something Carissa Savar probably never could understand, though maybe she might understand it now, because to her, Keltham would be Keltham even if he collapsed into a lemure. He does not, probably, even now, understand how someone can end up justly owning a Carissa. Or maybe it's a kind of ownership that has no place for justice. It seemed dishonest to Mid-Keltham to go on claiming ownership of Carissa when he had changed so much in his self and his intentions from the person she offered that to, and when she herself had first named him her owner in Cheliax under conditions of conspiracy, and even her affirmations at the conspiracy's ending were still within Cheliax's power and Asmodeanism's delusions. He did not understand Carissa's sexuality, whether she needed to be taken, and any talk of giving cut against her grain. Actually, now that he reviews these thoughts, it's obvious that there was a Chelish plot specifically to make him think that clear metacommunication and explicit consent was unsexy, because they were trying to get him to rape an actual victim so he'd go to hell.
Yes, there was definitely that. But also, Cheliax is what shaped Carissa. The shape that it made her is not the shape she would have grown on her own outside Cheliax, but there's not a lot to be gained, even here and now where she has the wisdom and distance and insight to do it, in trying to be the person she would have been if she hadn't grown up in Cheliax. That person is that person, and Carissa is Carissa. And there was a conspiracy when she offered herself to Keltham, and it is entirely reasonable and fair of him to not want to count that, to not want to hold her to anything she said then, but as he said to her at one point, if you take away culpability and responsibility in everything Carissa did in Cheliax, there's nothing left, really. She did not, when she made those promises, think that they were pretend because they were inside of the conspiracy. It was in part because she still loved Keltham, because she still wanted to be his, that she came to him, instead of doing something that from the outside would be more likely to achieve her goals, like accepting from Osirion a ludicrous amount of money for a warning about what Keltham was planning and then warning every other god as well. And it is very Keltham of Mid-Keltham who denied he was Keltham at all, to not want to have something that he was going to get wrong, something that was dishonest, and probably it would have damaged him, to try to disentangle what inside Carissa was real, what kinds of realness was acceptable to him. Certainly she expects it would have hurt him if he'd tried to carry on from where they'd once been. Maybe it would also have hurt her. She's not as sure. She thinks that Keltham mostly hurts her when they're not clear on who wins, so he thinks he has to fight, and not when he is clear on it. In her imagination, if she is unconstrained by real Keltham and where he was at and what he needed, and just imagining the thing that would have been good for Carissa who loved Keltham when she arrived, Keltham would have told her his plan, up front, crying, told her he did not want to do it, that he hoped she could find another way, but that he had to, for all the people in hell, if he couldn't find another way, and asked her if she still loved him, if she would ever have loved him if she had known that about him from the start, and she would have cried and said that if there were an answer to that question which involved the world not ending, she'd give it regardless of which one it was. But if there really isn't, if he really and truly cannot be moved on that and is eager to be moved on everything else, then yes, she still loves him. And the things she told him were good. She never lied to him about that. And if he hurt her now, that would be good. But objectively, it was probably wildly more sensible for him to break up with her.
If by objectively, Carissa means in the counterfactual case that we weren't embedded inside something at least a little like an aerolarp, then sure, objectively, they weren't failing at unknown aerolarp flags and maybe dooming the universe. He wonders whether Snack Service, Nethys, Caden Kylean didn't know the right thing for Mid-Keltham to do. Didn't know to steer for that, or didn't know how to safely navigate there in a way that didn't risk creation. Or if they knew that was a possibility, a way to salvage their relationship, but they chose otherwise, it is not for him to think of such things. He will tell Ione and Pilar of it, maybe, for all its privacy, in case it's the sort of thing where this world isn't the most real world, only a possibility foreseen, and all that they do is for the sake of some Keltham and Carissa more real than this. That they find themselves here, rather than there, is strong evidence against that possibility, but obviously every possible version of yourself should ignore that sort of evidence to get the best global outcomes. His failure, in the end, was from trying to optimize for two goals at once. Mid-Keltham didn't want to tell Carissa about the plan to destroy creation before he obtained her wishes and contracted to rent her headband. And it wasn't, obviously, that he was the type to cheat Carissa, but that if Carissa aided Mid-Keltham while knowing his plans, and this decision was influenced by her having deduced the obvious point that Snack Service thought Pharasma would yield and end hell rather than lose creation, Pharasma would look through himself and see Carissa. And also Mid-Keltham didn't want to betray Carissa, didn't want to turn her loyalty or love to what she'd see as one of the most horrifying purposes imaginable. So he gave her warning and asked to negotiate with her, tried not to presume on friendship, let alone ownership, and it seems in the end that he maybe ended up with neither desideratum, but certainly not the first one. But he did it to protect creation, in the end, that he didn't just tell her everything right away.
Well, she can hardly be angry about that. Maybe when she was small and scared and stupid, but not now. And hey, maybe nothing will happen to creation, and the gods will negotiate a compromise, and they'll live happily ever after. If she were speaking baseline, this would be inflected as highly unlikely.
Or maybe they'll love again as gods, and the Aerolarp will count that as a happy ending for them. He doesn't feel like he would count it that way. He feels that no ending where he becomes a god so suddenly could be a happy one for him. But maybe he'll feel differently as a god, and that's all the Aerolarp cares about.
Maybe when he touches the Starstone, he'll wake up somewhere else, with a Carissa, with whom he can figure out what he wants.
If it's a new Carissa, and not a Carissa who remembers, at least everything up until they said goodbye inside Cheliax, then that doesn't count either, to be clear to anything that cares. He got her a +4/+4/+4 belt of physical perfection in the City of Brass. They only had the one belt, and it is for her, not for him. In part because his own path seems straightforward by comparison, he just has to destroy creation if it be not saved. To do something else which is not that might be harder. And in part, as a gift, he guesses, or an apology, or whatever there is between them now. He got her a black robe of the Archmagi, too.
Oh, she takes it she's not supposed to do the thing, that the Dath Ilani thing is not actually too. Be very careful not to get any emotions near anyone in this specific situation.
That's not actually the Dath Ilani thing, no. By now, regardless, they should be past the point of deferring much to a distant world's comms protocols for idiots.
She loves him, and she misses him, and she wishes he were doing anything at all that wasn't this, so she could learn to understand him and earn his forgiveness and be his forever and build civilization with him, for him, so he isn't lonely anymore. She will try so hard to do something that is not letting everything and everyone die, mostly for the sake of everything and everyone, but partially for his sake. He would actually be happy if she found something. She sometimes feels like he wants this doomed course, but he doesn't really. And if there's anything else to be found, she will find it.
Seeming to be given everything, and finding the courage to trust in it, and having it all ripped away from him, has wounded him on a level that doesn't really seem worthwhile to try to recover from inside of creation. If he could live happily ever after with Carissa, though, he would give it a try for that. Losing her is not all of the hurt, but it's most of the lasting wound that feels like it couldn't heal naturally and isn't correct to heal artificially. He is glad to know, at least, that she loves him and misses him. And he loves her and misses her, and he also wishes he was doing anything that wasn't this. She wouldn't have very much forgiveness to earn for what she did under threat of hell. Peranza and Asmodia getting shattered might have been a problem, but they weren't, and he doesn't want this doomed course. He just doesn't think that even the gods and the Arrow LARP are on course to get them out of it. On the surface of things, the story they're inside has too many dangling plot threads and character arcs cut short for this to be a perfect run that gets the best ending, and he hopes that this was just a dry run, a possibility almost entirely not real that gives valuable information to Nethys or Caden Kylian, but he knows that his awareness of his own awareness is probabilistic evidence against that.
Carissa doubts this is the best ending for Nethys or Caden Kylian, but she doesn't care at all about either of them and remains the slightest bit optimistic it might be a very good result for her. For Keltham seems less likely, but maybe she'll think of something.
He is a little jarred by the thought that things could go well for Carissa but not him. He had intuitively modeled them as closer linked in fates or as people than that. But he sets the thought aside. There is a known clockbound on all of this. They don't have that much time left on Detect Thoughts. There is an algorithm to be shown her. Before then, he'd know her informal thoughts, on promises and oaths with the lover who left her bereft, so he could destroy creation and diminish the reality of all the souls inside it. Maybe for reasons based on unshareable evidence, reasons that she will end up sure herself are mistaken.
She is going to be a lawful god. There are a lot of things, important things, that you can only build that way. And Nethys sees other worlds, sees other Carissae, sees other Kelthams, and she is pretty sure she gets more of what she wants. In the grand view, if her word is meaningful, if it's possible for her to mean what she says. She is not sure if she wishes she'd sold Keltham out to whoever would listen the instant she realized his plan. It depends what the gods have in store. But she didn't, and won't, even if he is obviously wrong or obviously monstrous. If she were different, she wouldn't be here.
Lawfulness is Pharasma's take on things. It's a bundle of ideas that Pharasma chose and bundled. It is the sort of package deal that people maybe see through at this INTWWS, even if they have no training at all in seeing through package deals. And Carissa now has some of that training, even if it is secondhand off Dathilan. It would not surprise him terribly if somewhere in this plot they come to a point where Carissa somehow learns that she's beyond the sight of Nethys. He doesn't predict it very strongly, but they are inside of something with at least some story-like qualities. Any pillar of her trustworthiness that she names to herself, knows to herself, as her own support, is liable perhaps to be tested. Set aside Pharasma's bundle, set aside Nethys's manipulations. If there were no Pharasma and no Nethys, who would Carissa be, and why?
Carissa is not, actually, sure that you can neatly set everything aside like that. It's not that she agrees with Pharasma about everything. It's not that she wouldn't kill Nethys if the opportunity presented itself and wouldn't destroy any universes. But there's no truth of who and what she is that is totally separate from the world in which she operates, has always operated, will always operate. In a world where it was impossible for gods to credibly communicate facts about their intentions to other gods, and impossible for mortals to do it either even at lower resolution, there might still be some algorithm in Dathilan. But it wouldn't be a description of how things work, and Carissa would not let universes die for it. She lives in a world where you can choose whether anyone can trust you or not, and it is in that world and in that context, and in the shape of the god she wants to be, that having given her word, she won't kill Keltham even to save the world.
Look, it's not that improbable that Carissa's going to end up in a different universe at some point, maybe one where, in fact, there's not a Pharasma and a Nethys around. In his personal experience, only 50% of universes have Pharasmas and Nethisi in them, and 100% of his direct samples have ended up in another universe at least once. That was a thought continuation out of Dath Ilan, a reflex for pressing on thought experiments. But even reflecting more carefully on where his thoughts were steering, this doesn't seem like a thought line to abandon. Because of Pharasma and Nethys feel like weak contingent reasons to him, a reliance on something outside of Carissa for her strength and trustworthiness. He's got a family of starstone speculations where Carissa's degree of understanding and self-understanding about this topic may affect how lawful of a god she ends up becoming, maybe even her power as a lawful deity. From his perspective, the existence of Pharasma, or spells that detect lawfulness, or afterlives that depend on lawfulness, or alternate possibility perceiving gods like Nethys, straight out of contrived thought experiments, are a kind of external crutch. He feels about them the way that the Aurorian monk, Dorina, seemed to feel about the crown of infernal majesty. Seizing advantage of them is one thing, being unable to operate without them is another.
When you become a god, you decide what kind of being you are, in an important sense. Gods don't change very much. You can't exactly become Abadar and then decide later that you're going to cheat someone just once. Someone who'd cheat just once would never have been Abadar. The thing humans are doing is weaker and worse, and most of the justifications they'd give for it are contingent and complicated. Not just the ones labeled law and Nethys, but also the ones labeled honor and dignity and whatever else. Probably most humans wouldn't actually keep their word if it might mean the world was destroyed. Not humans who really understood how unimaginably horrendous the destruction of the world was. And that fact probably limited how many humans could be steered through whatever contrivances have steered them to here and now. It is a fact about Carissa that she has meant it every time she gave her word, even this time when she gave it believing that Keltham was the most profound evil the world had ever known, believing him much, much worse than Asmodeus, hating him. It is also a fact about Carissa that mostly this habit was not built out of the pieces that gods have as pieces of themselves, the parts of them that make them able to commit to things. It was built out of the knowledge that devils do it, and the desire to be one, and out of the desperate hope she could talk Keltham out of this, if only he could trust her enough to let her try. If he wants to know if she understands what pieces are in gods that let them commit to things, yes, she understands those pieces and intends to build herself around them. If he's looking for a different historical origin of what Carissa is, he won't find it.
In his own causal origins, he grew up with a deep respect for those honorable things people do, which are not founded from their first beginning on exactly correct decision theory, but which they can nonetheless feel deeply within themselves. He's not objecting to Carissa's causal origins, not at all. The main point where respecting imperfect decision theory blows up on you is when not both sides are respecting it. It's often emphasized in Dathilani fiction that you may not be able to get away with negotiating with aliens this way, that if you try to blunder ahead on just honor, the aliens may look at you and shrug and say, well, that thing sure is effectively a rock with cooperate written on it, rather than something whose output logically depends on our own output. It's imagining us as acting with honor, and that's false. We've got this other thing instead. So what do we care about how this thing conditioned its behavior on the behavior of this imaginary alien in its mind? It would have imagined the same alien no matter what we do now. This is obviously, in retrospect, a concealed warning against honorably trusting to the honor of computer-based intelligences who don't share that evolutionary history. But it also points to a potential failure of the join between two mortals, at the point where they both become gods. Abadar will bargain fairly with you even if you don't imagine him exactly right. It's in his utility function, and not in a weird alien way where he'll maximize you into a weird side corner of possibility space in course of maximizing how fair he was to you. Abadar is actually about fair dealing, not exactly in the way that mortals see fairness, but in a way that makes mortals be actually safe to bargain with him. To reciprocate the trust that underlies mutual cooperation in the prisoner's dilemma, even if something that imagined you wrongly, whose output doesn't quite logically depend on your own output, is yet still within the utility function of someone once called Keltham, who once was Abadar's priest. At least it stayed in him this far, though he's never quite really cared enough about any event in this possibly unreal universe for that pillar of himself to be tested. It's not as if Carissa was being twisted, torn, shattered in hell at any point during this. It's not as if he was given a chance to undo his children by lying. He is not sure it is quite in Carissa's utility function the same way, that even with creation at stake, she would never betray a tiny mortal who trusted in an incorrect imagination of her, or would she not? He does not know, and therefore asks. There are other courses between them, if the answer is no. This is not a question where only one answer preserves cooperation between them, and that there are other ways he wouldn't ever lie about to her in order to get a more honest answer from her, even if his thoughts could be that concealed.
She knows he wouldn't. She's grateful that he wouldn't. It's why she's here, instead of selling her information on what he was going to do to Osirian for a lot of money and then warning all the gods. She thinks that Carissa is, actually, lawful evil, not lawful neutral. She might betray a tiny mortal who trusted in an incorrect imagination of her, whose trust in her bore no resemblance to the bright, clear thing that devils and gods do. She'd try not to. It seems unlikely she would ever have to, and she wouldn't find it funny. She'd advertise as fact that she might do it, and she wouldn't do it if she'd said she wouldn't. But if there were a tiny mortal who wanted to destroy the world, and who sought lightning in the sky as proof of her commitment of confidentiality, and there was unrelated lightning in the sky and the mortal warned her, she'd prevent the end of the world.
Yeah, he kind of figured. To him, it seems an obvious attempt at resolving this, that while they are in this place, halfway between mortal and God, while their causal origin emotions are still in them, and the respect of it, and also they can understand and use real decision theory, that they build the real structure of a logical correlation between them, based on reading each other's minds and constructing real models of the decisions that they'll make over and over to not betray each other. He understands that something else might rise up inside her, once her own mind is no longer being read. But it will be something that knows decision theory, that knows that he was modeling how she might think even in that moment. By the nature of a bargain like that, the later Carissa become goddess could only be bound if she believed, presumably accurately because goddess, that she really wouldn't have gotten a chance to save the world if she'd made a different logical decision in the physical places its multiply represented, in the future at her later time of action, in the past within his accurate, though necessarily abstract model of her. This in turn means that he has to be ready, now, to remove that future capacity from future Carissa if he makes a different prediction about her. He hopes she is not incredibly upset about this. He wouldn't have to walk through it that way if her utility function said to be trustworthy, even to things that haven't sufficiently accurately modeled her own future decision to have introduced a logical, counterfactual dependency on her within the past. Not just that the past happens to correctly guess her decision, but that the past would have made a different guess if future her chose differently. No statuing nor any other deprivation of consciousness will be involved, no matter what.
She's not upset about that. She's harder to upset now anyways, but even the Carissa he first met wouldn't have been upset about that. Using force to get what you want is not an upsetting move, not the kind of thing that stands in the way of further cooperation, as long as you're provoked to it predictably.
Some part of him is still surprised by hearing that, strangely. At this level of cognition, he'd better only need to be surprised once, or he's asking for a refund on Galarian's whole concept of intelligence enhancement. Let them go to it then.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059